and welcome to another geography lesson. Today we're going to discuss settlements, and we're going to discuss specifically rural settlements. Now, very importantly, Gr12, when we look at the different terms, I want to concentrate on those two words. Now, what is a settlement? Simple definition for a settlement, it's where people live. But most importantly, when we look at rural settlements, it's where a type of activity has taken place. Now, before I want to continue with this lesson, we need to understand something. It's a misconception. A township is not a rural settlement. A township is an informal settlement that lacks basic needs and services. A rural settlement exists because of a function. Now, if you look at the next slide, there's one main function taking place in a rural settlement, and that's mainly primary economic activities. Now, just if we look at the three economic activities, we look at primary, secondary, and tertiary. Now, I'm going to give you three examples that you need to keep in mind. Fishing is a primary activity. So it happens in a small little village next to the coastline. Mining is a primary activity. For instance, mining for gold or platinum. Now keep in mind, this rural communities may change into urban settlements over time. But the main function why it develops is because of the primary activities. Now, for instance, mining might change. It might change over to an urban settlement. But most likely, if we define rural settlement, is usually where farming and forestry taking place. It's a community that utilizes the land to be productive. So what do we say? It's unifunctional. There's only one main function. That's primary. So the main function on that piece of land is to farm crop. Now, secondary activities that we're going to discuss a bit later in the next lesson is where we take this crop and we turn it into maize or into bread. And tertiary activity is selling the product, for instance, shops. Now, a simple example, for instance, forestry. Forestry is where the trees are being planted, and then secondary activity is sending these trees to be manufactured into paper, into furniture. And the tertiary activity is, for instance, where we find it in schools that acts as a service or being sold. Now, urban settlements are multifunctional, like I've mentioned. It's got more economic activities. Urban settlements, for instance, Johannesburg, has got many secondary activities. Manufacturing of steel, processing of food, factories developing material, and tertiary activities that provide services and selling the product. Whereas rural areas only focus on the primary activity. Now, if you look at the next slide over there, a rural settlement are classified according to the size and complexity. Now, like I've already discussed with you, complexity, it's not very highly complex because it's only focused on a single economic activity like farming. And the size we're talking about the settlement, the amount of people that live there. Now, if you look at rural settlements, most of the land are being used for agriculture. And it's usually just the farmer. So if you look at the settlement itself, it's going to be very small. Now, a rural settlement are classified according to the size, like I've mentioned. And if you look at rural settlements, it's usually farmsteads, hamlets, or villages. As soon as a rural settlement changes into a town or a city, it changes over to an urban settlement. Now, we have all of the above in rural settlements. We do have towns in South Africa, we do have cities in South Africa, we do have metropolis in South Africa, we've got a conurbation, and we got a megalopolis. But unfortunately, we do not experience this one in South Africa. If you look at the next slide, you can see the classification. A farmstead is a single farm. So it's basically a farm that produce crops, for instance, mealies. And on this farm is a single house and with a couple of buildings that he uses to be productive on this farm. A hamlet is usually a big piece of land where a couple of farmhouses are situated close to one another. And a village is just a bit bigger than a hamlet, where it's a bit more dense. It means the farmsteads are closer to one another, and it can range from up into 10 to more little farmsteads altogether. But when we look at urban areas, towns, now immediately when we move to towns, what happens? The function changes. Now, if you look at towns, what will you find? You will find shops. You will maybe find small furniture businesses. You maybe find schools and hospitals. Do you see what I mean? The function has changed. The size has changed because now all of a sudden there's more functions. There's schools that access tertiary activities. There's hospitals that access tertiary activities. And there might be manufacturing businesses situated over there, making furniture or producing fresh produce, making jams or milk, etc. A large town, for instance, cities, we have them in South Africa. Just example of towns, Harry Smith, Beaufort West, quite a few. Large towns where many people live and work is classified as cities, for instance, East London and Bloemfontein. A metropolis is, for instance, Cape Town, Durban and Port Elizabeth. It's much bigger than a city because the surrounding towns are very close to it. Then we got a conurbation. Johannesburg is a very beautiful example of a conurbation. Basically, it's when two cities are basically next to one another. For example, Johannesburg and Pretoria. Now, keep in mind, urban areas grow as well over time. Now, for instance, 20 years ago, there was still veld between Johannesburg and Pretoria. Not anymore. Because what happened? The size of these urban settlements became bigger. And it ends up being known as a conurbation. A megalopolis we do not experience in Southern Africa, but we do see them in America, especially on the East Coast. We have Washington, New York, and Boston. It's massive cities situated next to one another. So keep in mind, a settlement is classified according to the size and complexity. And when we refer to the size, we actually talk about how many people live there, and complexity is the amount of services that you can find over there. But right now, what are we going to do? We're going to focus on rural settlements. And like we discussed, the main function over there is primary activities. Like we've mentioned before in the previous slides, it's unifunctional, mostly one function. Primary activities, for instance, farming and forestry. Now, if you look at it, where do we find these primary activities? Usually where there's farming taking place, fishing, or mining. Now, keep in mind, like I've mentioned, the function may change over time. For instance, if you look at Johannesburg, what was the main function of Johannesburg? It's known as the city of gold. It was where gold was discovered. So Johannesburg, in theory, was a mining town. But over the years, what happened? The function has changed. There's no more gold over in the Johannesburg region, so what happens? Manufacturing takes place. Tertiary activities takes place, services. Because there was such a big influx of people moving to Johannesburg that there was a demand for other services. And there was a demand for other needs. Now there's a perfect example, if you look at this diagram, of a rural settlement. Right, there you can see a couple of villages over there. Most importantly, Forget about this fishing. This is just a guy fishing in a dam. When we talk about fishing, as a rural settlements usually next to the coastline. But as you can see, all the farmland that we can identify over here. And you can see the small hamlets and villages on this diagram. And as you can see, that's silos representing where the crops usually being taken once it's being harvested. Now, if you look at the land use in rural areas, most of the land being used are used to be farmed with. Now, agricultural activities use roughly 12.1% of the land. Now, when we farm, there's two types of farming techniques taking place: commercial and subsistence cultivation. Now, very importantly, when we think of commercial, that's when the farmer farms to make a profit. So usually when you drive in the Northwest Province and you drive through the rural areas and you go to Gr12, these areas, you will see, as far as you can see just lands always full of crops. Now the purpose for that is the farmer farm to make a profit. So what he does is basically farming this produce, this crop, this mealies, to sell and to make a living. And then we have subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is completely different. Subsistence farming is to farm only for your own needs. So instead of just farming like the commercial farm, just only farming with crops or cattle, a subsistence farm with everything. It's got a couple of goats over there, some cattle over there, a small piece of land is cultivated, and basically he just farms for his own needs to basically feed his own family. Now, as you can see, although rural communities focus on primary economic activities, there's also a number of different ways in which the land can be used. And we're going to have a look at it right now. Like I've mentioned, subsistence, you only farm for yourself, to provide for yourself. So that doesn't necessarily be only crop, it can be some cattle, it can be goats, chickens, whatever, but that you need to provide your family with food. Now, the purpose of subsistence farmer is not to sell his produce, but to consume them. And like we've looked at commercial farming, is to generate income. Now, the commercial farmers is basically the big farmers that basically employ a lot of people. That's got trucks to transport their goods to manufacturing, or to not manufacturing, but off to be processed eventually, and to make this food that they farm into a different product. Now, commercial farming can be intensive or extensive. Now, there's a difference between the two. The one depends on a great labor force, and the other one do not depend on a great labor force. For instance, when we look at intensive farming taking place, now remember, both of them is commercial farming. Many workers are needed. Unfortunately, it's not like crop farming, where most of the machinery these days are mechanized. So like, for instance, harvest machines, tractors, etc. For instance, let's use a grape farm. On a grape farm, you still literally need people to go and pick the grapes from the vineyards. And it's very productive, it's high yields per hectare. So when it's harvest season, the farm is going to be very productive, and a lot of work are being generated out of this farm. When we look at extensive farming, and it usually happens in areas, arid areas as well, especially where we can't actually go and plant crops. So mostly of the Karoo landscape, that's ideal, for instance, for sheep farming taking place. The land can't be utilized to farm with, so we can't plant crop. It's not very fertile. But if you look at the sizes of these farms, are absolutely massive. So they actually use the sheep, and they can just walk around and feed themselves. And with this type of farms, you don't need a lot of people to be employed on a farm like this. Now, if you look at commercial farming, it can divide it up into stock farming, crop farming, and mixed farming. Stock farming involves animals, for instance, cows, chicken, sheep, and pigs. Now, once you look at crop farming, biggest examples in South Africa is maize and wheat. And many farmers has moved to mixed farming because they can use the mixed farming as an advantage. They can feed the cattle from the crop that they harvest. So these three is the three main type of commercial farming we find in South Africa. Now keep this in mind, Gr12s. The food that you eat on your table comes from the farmers in South Africa. The meat that you get from the butchery, the fruit that you get from the shops, and the maize, the bread you get from your grocery stores. All of these are commercial farmers, and the purpose of these commercial farmers is to sell it to the community. And in return, they can pay the workers and they can make money off it. Now, we got two different sets of patterns in rural settlements. We got dispersed patterns and nucleated patterns. Now, if you think of nucleated, as you can see, they are stacked together. So many farmers decide to live closer to one another. And we get dispersed patterns where the farmers live very far from one another. Now, there's a couple of reasons why rural settlements are nucleated and some rural settlements are dispersed from one another. Now, a couple of reasons for it. It can be, if you look at nucleated rural patterns, many farmers these days do it for safety concerns. And because obviously sometimes it's not as safe on the farms anymore, so the farmers rather live closer to one another. And if you look at the dispersed patterns, the reason why the farmers live far from each other is because they have sufficient enough water and fertile land. Once we come back after the break, we will discuss more characteristics of nucleated and dispersed settlements.